He's not just an expert, he's also self-proclaimed, from what I hear, a warehouse nerd.
I did not study warehousing or supply chain or anything like that. I ended up just getting a job. I needed a job, so I got a job as an inventory control specialist. It seemed easier to sit down and talk, basically, right, was my general impression. Because actually, I had never listened to a podcast before I started my podcast, so I was not
Okay.
familiar with that world. What if we did, something like that for warehousing? Like maybe we would make warehousing like look sexy, right?
Welcome everyone to the Vserve e-business solution podcast on supply chain management, where we invite some of the great industry experts to talk about their experiences and gather some helpful tips along the way. I'm Cynthia, and today we're joined by someone who has a unique perspective on the world of supply chain. He's not just an expert, he's also self-proclaimed, from what I hear, a warehouse nerd who has brought a fresh and exciting voice to the industry through his content advisory services. He's also the host of the new Warehouse podcast. Please do check that out. So please welcome Kevin Lawton. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and happy to be here. It's good to be a guest instead of the host this time. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I hope I live up to the hosting standards. I'm new in this, so we'll figure it out as we're going along.
You're doing good so far. You're good. Yeah.
Perfect. So Kevin, your work, around warehousing is very intriguing to me, because from where I stand, like warehouse is the boring part of the job, right? So that's what I used to believe
I
until
disagree.
until I heard from you. And I've seen a little bit of your podcast, but I would love to know a little bit more about you, your career, but why warehousing?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. Why warehousing? Because I certainly did not set out or plan to be in the warehousing industry. It just kind of happened, which I think is the case for many people that are in this industry. When I got out of college, I did not study warehousing or supply chain or anything like that. I ended up just getting a job. I needed a job, so I got a job as an inventory control specialist. That was kind of my first little taste and foray into warehousing, and then it just kind of evolved and grew from there. And at some point, I just wanted to kind of embrace that as a career because I thought it was interesting. There was a lot of problem solving that I was involved in, especially like on the inventory control side, and that was, I think, intriguing to me. And it wasn't kind of the same thing every day necessarily. And and so then at some point I decided like, hey, I should learn more about this industry if I'm going to be working in it for a longer period than initially I thought, right? And that's kind of how the podcast came about, because I was searching for something interesting to learn from and just couldn't find it. And so I'm like, well, maybe I'll start something myself. And at first it was going to be a blog, but then I didn't quite have the time to write and edit and figure all that stuff. So somebody suggested I should maybe do a podcast, and I'm like, oh, like that sounds a little easier, which it's not as easy as it seems, I will say.
Yeah.
But it seemed easier to sit down and talk, basically, right, was my general impression. Because actually I had never listened to a podcast before I started my podcast, so I was not familiar with that world at all. And so yeah, I just started doing that kind of on the side, a little creative passion project, a little self-fulfilling, trying to learn more about the industry, and then continued to work in the warehousing industry for a number of years during the podcast. And now I've been fortunate enough to grow it into its own thing, and that's kind of my full-time gig, along with doing some advisory work, as you mentioned, and also as an adjunct professor in supply chain. Funny enough, teaching at my alma mater where I went to college, but I did not go for supply chain. So it's quite a very interesting kind of circle there. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So, I was going through like your information, your LinkedIn profile, and there's a word you use, and I hope I can use that in the podcast, but you called warehousing a very differentiated word, and it's called sexy. So,
Sure.
what makes you kind of come out with that word? Why is it exciting for you?
Yes. And if I don't know if you're watching on video, I mean, it's right behind me, right on the shirt. Warehousing sexy, but it's a very interesting way that kind of stuck and came out. And when I was starting or thinking about starting this podcast, I had a friend from college, still a friend to this day,
Mhm.
and he had gotten into a role where he was doing social media work for a blog that was focused on cars, and it was focused on everything automotive kind of. And they were doing things at the time, this was 2018, 2019, where they were doing social media and they were making like, these sexy kind of clips of like cars, right? Which is
Yeah.
which, cars they have this, I mean, certain cars, not every car, have a little bit of sexiness to them, right?
Yeah.
And you can do those kind of interesting videos and shots that make them look really cool and things like that. So I was kind of like, what if we did, something like that for warehousing? Like maybe we make warehousing like look sexy, right? And in that sense, right? And as I was learning more about the industry, I'm like, oh, it is kind of like sexy. Like there's technology coming into play. There's robotics, automation. There's, all these things. And when the processes flow, I'll tell you, ooh, that's the sexiest to me. But I will say like, so basically I wrote this article talking about what I was planning to do with the podcast, and I put it on LinkedIn, and the title was Warehouses Are Sexy with a question mark, right? And I didn't think much of it. And then that just kind of stuck. Like people would be like, oh, warehouses are sexy. Like I saw that article, or warehouses are sexy, right? This and then I kind of jokingly said it here and there, and then just over time, like people are like, oh, your warehouses are sexy, guy, right? And so kind of I think in the last maybe 2 years or so, I'm like, all right, let me just embrace this thing, and so that's like my LinkedIn little tagline, and we have the t-shirts, and we have stickers, and we have warehousesaresexy.com. We own that domain too, so you could go there.
Wow.
If you want a t-shirt, you can go there and get a t-shirt. But yeah, that's kind of how it came about. And it's very interesting because like you said, and I think there's a large amount of people that also say the same, that like, warehouses, like they're dirty and they're boring and all these things. But I think for those that are in industry and they know, and they've been, around these things that are happening, like there is a sexiness to it. And when everything is kind of, there's so many moving parts and pieces from like an equipment perspective, from a people perspective, from a technology systems perspective in the warehouse itself, when all that's humming together and moving in kind of full cohesiveness and it's just flowing, like that's the real kind of like sexy part of the warehouse, in my opinion. So I kind of where that comes from. And if you don't believe in it, then the goal of the podcast is try and convert you to a believer.
Perfect. That's like a perfect explanation of where that comes from.
Sure.
But since like you said, podcast is not what you thought it was going to be, right? Just sitting and talking. How do you think it has evolved over time for you when it comes to just talking about warehousing, right? Like I'm pretty sure when you talk about this, you are bringing in different aspects like the new technology, AI being a new part of it. How does that, evolve over time in terms of your podcast series?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a very interesting evolution. Like I think for one, when I started it, the first episode came out in 2019. So it's been about 6.5 years now of doing this, which is just crazy for me to just say in general, because I never thought that. I was never like, oh yeah, I'm going to be doing this 6 years from now, right? It was just kind of like, let me try this and learn a couple things, and I'll see where it takes me. But I think the evolution, for one, certainly, and I think that the timing, and this was not planned or anything, but the timing just happened to kind of work out where this evolution over the last 6 years of technology in the warehousing industry has just been crazy. We've seen some of, I always say that, one of the coolest and most interesting things about our industry kind of right now and over the last couple of years has been, there's these big ideas around tech and, whether it's AI or robotics and automation, but a lot of that stuff is like an idea. And then people are looking for practical applications to apply it to, and they're finding the warehouse industry as that place to do that. So we get to see a lot of that practical things kind of applied in our industry first. So how has the podcast evolved around that? I think it's just naturally kind of evolved to, what's the technology doing? How are things changing? And I certainly have seen like an influx of startups as well. I will say, coming into
Mhm.
the space, especially focused on kind of these niche little processes in between. Right?
Mhm.
When I started, the conversations were like say broad, but much bigger ideas. Like we were focused on automating picking, right? Or we're focused on the overall WMS, or that type of thing. Whereas now, like you see, there's a startup, and all they're focused on is like returns, right? Or all they're
Mhm.
focused on is optimizing the pick path for using AI, right? Something like
Mhm.
that, where they're optimizing the carton packaging as these
Yep.
smaller things that these little softwares are popping up and filling a gap that are really making a big difference in the grand scheme.
Mhm.
But it's so much intricacies within
Yep.
operations that it seems like there's kind of never ending stream of conversations to have, where when I started, a lot of people were like, a podcast about warehousing, like, what are you going to do, like
Yep.
5 episodes, like how are you going to have so much to talk about, right? And we have 600 some episodes now, so obviously
Yep.
there's a ton to talk about. And I think as we continue to evolve, what we're trying to do now is had a ton of solution providers on, like people providing the technology or systems or equipment, but
Mhm.
definitely we're focused more on getting more of the actual shippers and end users on the podcast too now, to get kind of their perspective on what's happening within their operations, or what are they thinking about these technologies, and those types of things. So I think that's kind of been the evolution of the conversations. But I will also say that the evolution of the idea of a podcast in the industry is certainly evolved a ton too. When I first
Yeah.
started it, I mean, some companies in the world and culture that we live in now,
Mhm.
with so much social media, podcasts. So in 2019, it was like very hard for me to try and get guests a lot of times on the podcast. And so I
Mhm.
had a lot of companies, like I would approach them and say like, hey, can we get somebody on? And, no cost, no catch, nothing. Just want to, talk to somebody. And they'd be like, oh, we don't see the value of podcasts right now. Right.
Yeah.
And now, fast forward to now, it's like some of those companies probably have their own podcast, or like that's a big part of their marketing strategy, is getting like people on to
Yep.
podcasts, right? So even that has like evolved in how people kind of learn about the different industries and consume the content, and think about like how to get their message out there. So it's been very interesting to see kind of the evolution on all fronts there over the last kind of six
Yeah,
years.
perfect, perfect. So when you're thinking about, now but also the future of warehousing, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of job roles, even like in different industries that exist today, which we know that are going to be fully automated or even, outsourced in the next, 10, 15 years. I'm saying like maybe 5 years, even, the way that AI is moving. So, according to you, what roles do you think will get replaced in this, warehousing especially? And is it like, good thing to outsource it to companies that have been fully automated and can manage those services?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, because honestly, the one question this year have really enjoyed asking people, and this is a kind of a different way to look at it, I think, is when we think about current state and what traditionally has been the entry level role for a warehouse employee, right? Someone working in the warehouse is typically a material handler, right? Somebody that's going to come in and maybe they'll move pallets around with a pallet jack. Maybe they're unloading a
Yep.
container or a trailer by hands, right? Maybe they're doing just labeling stuff for vast work or a project, right? That's
Mhm.
typically kind of that entry level point. And then, maybe they'll then build up to be a picker, or build up to be a forklift operator, right? A packer, things like that, a little more technical. What I think is the interesting thing to think about, right, is as the more automation comes in from a physical standpoint, like robotics, right, and then AI too as well. If we think, 5, 10, 15 years from now, what does
Mhm.
that entry level position look like? Right.
Yeah.
Because when we think about the automation and robotics, I mean, that is, always kind of going after what are these repetitive, unattractive kind of tasks, right? Which are, a lot of it is like heavy lifting, right? People don't want to do that, right?
Mhm.
Even if you're like a bodybuilder, you don't want to, unload containers and trucks by hand all day
Yep.
long, 5 days a week, right? And then get
Yep.
home and just be exhausted and don't want to do anything else, right? So I think when you look at it, you have to think about what is that entry level position going to be, and I think it's going to be more like a kind of a robot supervisor, robot wrangler. I've heard some people say, and they're going to be looking at it from the perspective of, okay, and a company will be looking at it from the perspective of, I have this employee, and
Yep.
what 3, 4, 5 employees are doing today in 2025. I need one
Mhm.
employee to be doing and accomplishing in, you know, 2030. Right. So how do you look at that and get more from that employee? I think the idea of a dark warehouse or a lights out warehouse, fully
Mhm.
automated, I think that's very hard to get to. And I think that
Yeah.
it's possible, right? And it has been done already in some scenarios, but it has to be a very repetitive, very predictable type of environment and operation, which in many cases for warehousing is kind of rare, right? I mean, you look at the 3PL industry in general, right, which is doing a large majority of just e-commerce fulfillment, right? There's so many variables in
Yeah.
one building there. You got multiple clients, multiple different types of products, special packaging needs, right? Special shipping needs, all these things where it's a little more high touch, and it's very difficult to try and fit multiple clients into one box of
Mhm.
automation, right? So I think that evolution, I think naturally there's not going to be enough people that want to work in the warehouse, right? So I think robotics and automation and AI is like a necessity, right? But I think that how it evolves and what jobs it's going to take away potentially
Mhm.
are the ones that are less kind of skilled, right? Less meaningful touches. So like somebody that's unloading containers, floor loaded containers of cases, it's going to be automated, I think, right? And I think the
Mhm.
majority of people are not clamoring for that job, right? But I think too, from a higher level perspective, if we look at a warehouse manager, supervisor, data analysis and things, that's often something that kind of falls in the cracks for those
Mhm.
leaders, right? Especially for like a small or medium sized business where they don't necessarily have the resources to just have like a dedicated analyst for their
Mhm.
warehouse, right? Or the operations team. And that
Yeah.
often falls onto that warehouse manager or that warehouse supervisor. But the goal, you want them to be out there kind of managing the people. So, when you're asking them to do some analysis or think about some kind of data thing, that's, I think, where oftentimes that can kind of gets kicked down the road a little bit. So I think AI is really going to help to empower those warehouse leaders to be able to accomplish more, be more efficient, be more effective, and have more visibility into, aside from what they're physically seeing, right? Have more visibility from a data
Mhm.
perspective to like what the actuality is happening on the floor and how to take action against that, whether it's, kind of after the fact, preventative future state, or even from a predictive standpoint to be able to say like, okay, well, I know if I look at my data for the last 3 years, for whatever
Mhm.
reason, this week, a year, we have like our highest amount of call outs, right? So how do I get ahead of that, and how do I predict that, and, look at those types of things? And that's just kind of an example, but that's kind of my thinking of where does these roles in the warehouse kind of evolve to, and what do they become?
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. But also, there are so many companies nowadays, like with the whole AI, the whole trends that are coming along, they are not really quick to jump on the bandwagon, right? They're taking their good old time. They're seeing what's going to stick, what's not going to stick, but they also have that traditional way of doing things. So, according to you, like what are some of the emerging trends that you have seen in the warehouse industry or supply chain that you think companies should jump on and kind of, start kind of taking in these trends into their traditional warehouse?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a big question because there's just so much there's so much out there right now. But I think to your initial point there, I mean, one thing I'll say is that I think as a whole, the industry is traditionally very averse or hesitant to embrace new technology. The
Yeah.
majority, at least. I mean, there are some that, obviously are kind of first movers and are really open to the technology, which I think is great. I mean, we see, obviously Amazon, right? It's huge on moving first in technology, and what they've
Yep.
done with robotics and automation is leading kind of the way in a lot of respects. But I
Mhm.
think in terms of trends that people should be looking at and embracing, I mean, I think for one, robotics and automation it's inevitable. There are a ton of options out there. So it's very hard to kind of navigate and do and figure out, like, okay, well, what should I automate first, right? What processes should I automate first?
Mhm.
And I think there are stepping stones there where you can look at, what's a very kind of easy process. Am I moving every day, multiple times a day? Am I moving like pallets from location A to location B? And okay,
Mhm.
can I get a
Mhm.
type of automated AMR forklift pallet jack to do that for me, something like that? But I
Mhm.
think you need to start testing the waters with that to start to understand. But before you get to that, I mean, I think the big thing that anybody needs to do before they even consider automation, robotics, or looking at an AI solution is making sure that their data is where it needs to be, because all of that stuff is going to be data driven, right? And if you're feeding the wrong data, then
Mhm.
it's not going to make any difference for your operation. It's not like I think sometimes we look at automation, robotics, AI as like this magic wand that's just going to make everything better. And if things are not good already, then it's not. Like, maybe things will move a little faster, but if you're still having issues, quality issues and things like that, you're just going to get them quicker than before, right? So
Mhm.
I think that's the big thing I would say. But I think that everybody needs to be looking to see, like, what can they potentially automate? What does that look like? What are the solutions that can do that? And then from an AI perspective, I think that there's tons of opportunities to be able to leverage AI, whether it's from like a back office perspective in a warehouse operation, administrative tasks. I mean, even just overall paper kind of reduction and collection of information. There's a lot of things I think that can be taken advantage of and utilized to increase processes and the efficiency there. And also just, going back to the piece about making sure that your data is in line. I mean, also just streamlining workflows to make sure that data collection is happening and consistently happening, and then you're able
Mhm.
to generate that. I mean, like a great example would be like BOLs, right? I mean, you have to keep BOLs for records for quite some time. And the traditional way that I've seen is you have paper, and the paper stacks up, and then you put them in bankers boxes, and you have like pallets up in the top of your racking in the back corner of the warehouse, just like with tons of
Yeah.
BOS pallets, right?
Yeah.
But there's like electronics, solutions now that are able to capture that and make sure that that chain of custody is happening the right way, and having those records, which is a lot easier to look up and utilize. And then you can utilize AI to increase kind of the depth of that data and the insights you can gain from that too as well. So I think everybody needs to be looking at it, doing a little testing, a little playing around with it. I don't think that, it's at a point where automation and robotics is like make or break for everybody.
Mhm.
And I think
Yeah.
that it's definitely something that can help you compete into the future, but you have to be very smart about it. And I think you have to make sure that you are optimizing first and you're being methodical in the way that you're approaching these solutions, and not going for, if you're picking on paper today, shocker, a lot of people still are, you're not going to go from picking on paper to, tons of robotics and automation in your warehouse, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's steps in between. I mean, like a step to automation from that is simply RF handheld scanners. I mean, that's a form of automation, even though we
Yes.
think robots right away, right? But those types of things too are things to embrace and think about, and how do we optimize those things? And then once we get the human process kind of fully optimized, solidified. Now, how do we take that and augment that human further using some of these newer technologies like AI and robotics?
Yeah. And also like companies think it's like a, huge financial constraint as well. Like when they're bringing on these new things, they always, when you're doing the financial, it all comes back to like, the financial analysis. It's going to be expensive, right? So a lot of time, these kind of little things are outsourced to companies or to offshore companies and stuff like that. So in your, time period in your career, what kind of jobs do you think have been outsourced that have worked well and that have not worked well for supply chain and warehousing both?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, offshoring and outsourcing some tasks can certainly work. I've seen it work well for especially like 3PLs. I know a lot of 3PLs that do some outsourcing and offshoring, but also from like a development perspective too. I see a
Mhm.
lot of people, looking elsewhere for kind of like software development or AI development in different countries, and the talent is there. And for somebody that's kind of starting out too, the cost is typically lower as well. But I think where there's sort of a balance or fine line between working and not working for outsourcing talent,
Mhm.
especially like the 3PL side, I think from like a customer success or customer kind of services type of person, right? There's certainly a place, I think, for outsourcing and a place for keeping it in-house, right?
Mhm.
There's something to be said for, working with a client where there's a client success manager or whatever the title you want to call it, right? Someone that's kind of like
Mhm.
the liaison between the client and the 3PL themselves. Something to be said for one that's like on site that can go out into the warehouse and figure out like what is the actual issue,
Mhm.
where, you have somebody that's different country or is not close, or, even in the same country, but not on site at the warehouse or close to the warehouse. I mean, then they got to reach out to the warehouse, somebody that's there, and then they have to physically go and figure it out. Where, someone could easily get up from the office, or if their desk is on the floor or something, go ask this person, hey, this order got stuck for whatever reason. Can you just like pick this so we can
Mhm.
process it through, right? That goes much quicker,
Yeah.
much of right. So there's a balance there between like when do you need still like that touch to be there and that physical presence to get better efficiencies versus like, okay, where is it just kind of, these communications that can happen anywhere in the world, essentially.
Mhm. Perfect. Perfect. That's a perfect way to explain it. I think there is a time and place for outsourcing, and that if, for companies to understand that, that's where I think a lot of consultancy comes into place before you go into these kind of services. So
Yeah.
apart from the word sexy that comes in your mind, what is
Sure.
that one emoji that you describe or you can kind of think when warehousing comes into mind?
With the emoji. Well, I often use the emoji with like the starry eyes, like you're
Uh-huh.
seeing something shiny and sparkly. That one. But I think for the for the warehouse, I think depending, like if you're working in the warehouse, depending on what day of the week it is, the emoji range can be incredibly
Yep.
wide. The spectrum of emojis can go from like, the the like
Exactly. It is a
angry
very
red one
random
with
job.
like the smoke coming out of the nose to like the one, full grin, or a lot of the times too, the one that like the sleepy one definitely I think comes into
Yep.
play. So I think every day is a little bit of a different emoji when you're working in the warehouse. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. So just, a few things in the end, but according to you, what are some of the essential, I guess, guidelines, tips or tricks that is essential for survival in today's, logistics world, warehouse, supply chain altogether? If you want to like, name three things.
Sure. Three things. Let's see. One, I will say, I think is you have to be curious, right? And
Mhm.
I say you have to be curious because if you're not understanding not only what's happening in your operation, and you want to learn about all the departments that are in your operation and how they're functioning currently, where their frustrations are, where there's room for improvement, also in the business as a whole,
Okay.
right? Like, how do you, if you pick something late, like, how does that impact the sales team? How does that impact finance? How does that impact customer service, right? How does that, what you do impact everything? And then also, how do those other departments, what they do, how does that impact your operation? Maybe there's something like they're doing, and this is like a lot of times where there may be something that's happening on the ordering side or the customer service side that they do. And, it's simple for them. They do this thing and, they push it through and they're done with it. Right. And then, but they don't realize that, oh, that's creating like this extra steps of work in the warehouse or the operation. Right. So that curiosity, I think, is essential to be able to get that full understanding and figure out like, what are the inputs and the outputs for my operation, and how do they impact the results and things that are happening for me on a daily basis that
Mhm.
maybe are frustrating or maybe are rewarding, right? And how do we
Mhm.
alleviate those with all departments? And then that curiosity to the next step is then how do I, keep my kind of learning hat on, right? To learn how other operations are tackling things, or, technology is evolving like we talked about here today. How do I keep up with that and, keep relevant with solutions that potentially could help to resolve my issues that may come up? The second one I think I would say is to, demonstrate and make sure that you are maintaining kind of a human like focus, or
Mhm.
an emotional intelligence too, maybe is another way to frame that. But
Mhm.
making sure that, in this world of technology and AI, right? I think, being able to still have a human element to the way that you're interacting with those that are in the operation, with different departments and customers, clients, right? Goes a long way and is going to
Cool.
be increasingly more valuable, right? The more that, the AIification, I guess, of our
Yeah.
communications and things like that, and the content we see, like that human kind of focused is going to become more valuable as well. The third one for survival in the warehouse world these days too is how can you retain employees? Because I think
That's a
that
big one.
there's a ton of discussion about labor shortage, right? And
Yeah.
being able
Yeah.
to get labor, right? But I think the bigger discussion, in my opinion, that's a challenge. Yeah, definitely. Like, how
Yeah.
do I get more employees? And I think depending on where you're located, where your warehouse is, like it can be harder because there's super competitive because there's just a million warehouses in one area, depending on where you're located, right?
Yeah.
But the bigger challenge, I think, is you get them in the door, but how do you keep them in the door,
Keep them.
right?
Yeah.
So figuring out the program to be able to retain these employees is definitely like a means of survival, right? Because if you're constantly having to recruit and your door, it's like a revolving door, like that is resource drain, right? I mean, that's like
Yeah.
energy drain. It's hard on the culture and a lot of aspects within the building. So figuring out and taking the time to invest in like a program to build up this, give people flexibility, bring in technology that makes the job enjoyable, or at least not, people like dreading doing the job, makes it easier for them, makes them more productive, doesn't disrupt their flow when they're working, reduce their frustrations for the employee, right? And then think about also their growth pattern, right? Like, how do you bring somebody in and how do they see like having a future with you, and having that
Mhm.
formalized and having a program in place can go a long way in reducing that employee turnover and making sure that you can effectively recruit and then retain these employees. And I think that's probably the third survival skill I'll say.
Perfect, perfect. That was great. I think that those are definitely essentials for today, for everywhere, like
Yeah,
retaining the human touch, right? But yeah, I mean, lastly, like my last question, Kevin,
sure, sure.
what give us one advice for the future warehouse nerds, or people who think of it like me, who used to think warehouses are mundane and boring jobs that you want to stay away from. How do you kind of see the future generation coming into warehouse? What's that one advice that you would give them that would make them also think that warehouses are sexy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting question because I teach the future generation, right, as an adjunct professor. And I think that, and I've been teaching for now 4 years. I'll be going into my ninth semester teaching in the next month here. And even in that time, I've seen an evolution of the students and what their understanding of supply chain and the different parts of supply chain are
Yep.
coming into the class, right? Like just day one, just I asked them kind of, why supply chain? Why are you interested, right? And that those answers have evolved to be more informed, more sophisticated, I will say, than when I first started teaching just a couple years ago. So I think the generation in general is recognizing what supply chain is in the first
Mhm.
aspect, which I think is important, right? But also getting into recognizing what are the different aspects. And I think getting them interested and getting them thinking that it's sexy in a way, right? I think is creating more awareness about what's happening, right? So
Yeah.
highlighting some of the technology, right? Highlighting some of the innovations that are happening in the space, and there's a ton of them, but highlighting them properly so they can see that and get excited about working with those types of things. I mean, this generation now at this point is, they're pretty much grown up in a digital environment their whole
Yep.
life, right? So if they're gonna go to one of those warehouses that are picking on paper, there's no way like they're gonna last there, or
Yep.
they're gonna be like what is this? Like, why do we do this way, right?
Yep.
Like there has to be an app for this, right? Or something, right?
Yep.
So
Mhm.
I think, from a company's perspective, companies need to think about how are they going to come in and view the work experience, right? How are they going to view technology? What is the user experience going to be like? Even if you do have a system and you're not picking up paper, like, is your system
Mhm.
very old? Is it like you're using the function keys to navigate and things like that? Like that's not intuitive to that generation. Would make no sense, right? So the user experience, awareness of what's out there, and an understanding of like how do we put out there into the world that, hey, a warehouse is not just four walls with a bunch of boxes inside. Like there's a ton happening, a lot of problem
Yeah.
solving, and a lot of technology, data analysis that goes into getting that box on your porch. So I think that's the way to kind of get them interested and show them some of the cool stuff too, and maybe they'll think that's a little sexy.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, Kevin, this has been such a fun conversation. I hope I was able to kind of, get some unique perspective out of you as the host while you were being, one of the guests. But thank you so much for your time today. And I really hope your teachings for Warehouse goes, more in depth as we go along for the next 100 years. So
Yeah, I
thank
don't
you
know if I'll
again.
be here for 100 years, but that would be nice. Sure, sure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me as a guest. I really appreciate it. And if people want to learn more about the podcast, they can go to thenewwarehouse.com or find it on any podcast platform that they prefer, or on YouTube. You can subscribe to our channel as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for joining us today and sharing your insights, Kevin. You have a good day now.
Thank you.